Well, we're on to lesson 39, which is going to be a whole nother empire, a whole nother group of people that are going to take over the world in the Middle East, as the world as they know it, I should say. And we're going to be talking about Rome. Well, Rome actually was pretty small at this time, and no one would ever think that the Roman Empire, or even the Roman people, would come together in an empire at that time. Um, but things happened just like they happened with Greece. So, do you remember the statue that Nebuchadnezzar's dream had that Daniel interpreted in chapter 2 of Daniel? It's quite a deal because it all came to pass. Do you know that everything that's prophesied in the Bible has either come to pass or will come to pass 100%, not just sometimes? So we have the statue, and we know the head of gold was Nebuchadnezzar's empire, was the Babylonian Empire. And they had taken over the world and been such a spectacular place back then. And in fact, it was one of the 7 wonders of the world, the Hanging Gardens of Babylon. And then, in one day, the Mede and the Persians got together. The Medo-Persian Empire conquered with Cyrus the Great, conquers Babylon. Who would know? So, as the Medes and the Persians go, and the Persians become strong, and you know all their names like Darius and Xerxes and Artaxerxes and Cyrus and all these guys. Pretty strong. Well, in the midst of all that, Greece comes in the picture with King Philip wanting to throw off the Greek or the Persian influence. And then, of course, we have Alexander the Great coming in a short period of time, conquering the world as he knew it, at a very young age. He was actually the general when he was only like 21 years old, which is pretty young. And he brought in his generals, his cohorts, the guys he went to school with under Aristotle. And so when he dies at a young age, he had conquered the world, but he didn't really get to see the world as he thought, with Greece, the Hellenistic culture taken over. Instead, his 4 of his Greek generals took over, and they became pretty nasty. And as times went on, their descendants were even worse. They fought among each other. They fought among them their own areas. They couldn't get along with their own families. We go on, and this went on for probably 300 some plus years. And during this time, we hear no prophecies. We know a Messiah is coming. So the time is getting ripe, but it's not Greece that's going to control the world during the time of Jesus. It's another little country that becomes a big empire, Rome. Now, we still have a lot of things of Roman culture, even in our culture, and we'll be talking about that later. And that's very important to know. So why are we learning about all this? Maybe so we won't make the same mistakes that they made. Maybe so we could see God's hand throughout the whole thing. Hey, especially, here's one tidbit I just found out about Alexander the Great. When Alexander the Great went into the promised land of Israel, he had as he come in, he thought, well, what is all this Hebrew about? And so they brought him the Hebrew Old Testament, and someone read them the chapters of Daniel that they thought were about him. So he, just like Cyrus, stands back and he says, I might be that goat in there with the one horn. And am I really going to overcome the ram with the 2 horns? Or have I? Is this me? So he had a chance to look at the Hebrew scriptures, possibly had a chance to change his whole life with God in it. Instead, he held on to those old fake gods like Zeus and all. But God weaves his thread all the way through history. And he's merciful and kind. And he's long-suffering to every culture to come back to him. And that's what we'll see, especially later on when we see the gospel coming out. First to the Jews, then to the Greeks, and then to the Romans. Well, we better get on here with lesson 39 on Rome. Well, Rome, where is Rome? And you can look, I want you to look in your book at the maps there. If you don't have a map, then look at it later. But if you look at Rome, Rome then was the Italian peninsula. It was Italy. Italy is the country. Rome was the city. And so you look in there and you say, well, I like the country Rome. Well, no. It's in Italy. Italy is the country, and Rome is that capital city there. So when you look at that picture, it looks like a boot. And actually to me, it kind of looks like a high-heeled women's boot, or, like a witch's boot or something. It's out into the Mediterranean Sea. And as you look a little bit down there at the boot, you'll see this big island. And the island kind of looks like a head. And then if you go lower, you'll see this neck coming up that doesn't quite connect to the head. And that is Carthage. And the island is Sicily, and we're going to be talking about that later. And this will be a good way for you to remember the wars that happened, because the wars start happening right in this very area. But always look, when you look at the Mediterranean Sea, you'll know where Rome and Italy are just by the boot. One good thing to know. I like these little things so I can remember them. So let's go back. We're going to talk about how Rome started. Well, they have this legend, and this legend of Rome went clear back, and it was just handed down, and really it was a story. And most people do not believe that it's true. But it was a story that the Etruscans that lived there, developed about how their culture started. Well, anyway, there was two babies that were actually just left by accident, but the mother had left them somewhere, and when she came back, the twin boys, they were gone. And they were taken by wolves. And they were raised by wolves their whole childhood. It's kind of exotic, huh? And the name of these two boys were Romulus and Remus. Well, later on, they come back, even though they're raised by wolves, they're on the wild side, you can imagine. And they're so on the wild side that they fight between themselves so much. And accidentally or on purpose, we don't know, Remus gets killed. And Romulus takes over, so they call it Rome. Well, the reason I think they put this whole thing together is because the Etruscans wanted to show how they are fighting warriors. Maybe. I don't know. But I think it's kind of a ridiculous story myself. And I don't really believe that it really happened. But a lot of times legends come down and we have to examine them in the historical perspective. So that was the Etruscan legend. The Etruscans lived in Italy. But also another group of people called the Latin people lived there also. So like 753 BC, the Etruscans and the Latins controlled Italy together, just like two wolves, like Romulus and Remus, yeah. And then till 150 years later, 600 BC, the Etruscans totally controlled Italy. And then another 100 years later, the Latin people came and they controlled Italy. So you had almost like a Romulus Remus going on there, don't you? And then as time went on, then we see Alexander coming in, and we see Greece taking over the whole Italian peninsula. Well, as time went on with Greece, the Romans really didn't like the Greek control. But they kind of liked the Greek culture because it was very intellectual, and plus they had these weird gods, and so they took their so-called gods that were not gods at all, like Zeus or whatever, and took him, and changed his name, and then took Aphrodite, changed her name to Diana. They had different names, but they looked like the same thing. How ridiculous is that? But that's what they did in Rome. And they took a lot of their culture in too, but they wanted to go farther and be themselves and not be Greeks anymore. So as they renamed things and refined things, the Romans were a little different because they were like really, really warrior type, the Etruscans were. And they weren't so intellectual, and they didn't trust totally in Aristotle and in all of those philosophers back then. They looked into him, but they weren't so interested in him as the Greeks were. So as as time went on through Rome, we have the Etruscans and the Latins coming together, and they wanted a way to unite together and rule together. In Italy, they wanted a united Italian Roman Empire to develop. So they developed a new way of ruling. They took just the good things out of Greece democracy, and they liked the idea of democracy, but they looked at Greece and thought, this is a little bit complicated. How does everybody come in and votes, and who votes, and how do you put a government together this way? So they decided to revise it into this new Roman way. The new Roman way was called the Roman Republic. Very important that you know republic, because we have a republic here. A republic means that certain people will choose representatives. And as they choose these representatives, they send them there so that they can rule for them or bring in their policies all together. So you don't have to have thousands of people meeting, but you have like 300 people that are representative of the whole, community or the whole country. So they decided to do it this way. They did not want a dictator. They did not want a king. They did not want an emperor. They were so afraid of them turning into tyrants and reigning over them and taking everything they had, that they wanted to have a democracy based on a republic so that they could oust or get rid of a dictator if they needed to. That was their thoughts. But they also, the citizens were a certain group of people. Instead of everyone being part of this, they chose the wealthy people. They would represent everyone. So the poor people really didn't get to be represented in the beginning. So what am I talking about? They had 3 classes of people. One of the classes was called the patrians, or I say patrians. Maybe you pronounce it more like patricians, There's different ways of pronouncing it. And these were the landowners, the very wealthy. And there were like 300 of them, and they were chosen to represent these families. In the beginning, they were chosen from their whole life. And these 300 people would serve in the Senate. Like us, we have senators, don't we? They had senators. And these senators would come together and they would elect 2 councils. And the councils would be the military leader or the head of the government. The councils, they would be able to veto each other or forbid each other or argue with each other till they came to a conclusion for the 2 of them. Or they also could choose a dictator just for a short period of time. A person that came to rule over all of them would only be able to rule for 6 months. And that was it. So you can see their attitude. Their attitude is very harsh in the midst of all this. The Senate met in the area that was called the Forum. And, remember that Agora in Athens is kind of familiar to that. It's the center of the town where the political meetings would happen and the law courts would happen. Shops and markets would be there. They could take a break and get something to eat or however. And they also had their pagan temples built there too, so they could take time and go worship their so-called gods if they wanted to. And they also had a prison right in the middle. It's called the... let's see, Mamertine prison. So, and that was in Rome. Another thing they had that is really crazy, and we're going to stop here and continue it. They had gladiators, and they had fights. Hundreds of people died in the midst of these gladiator fights. How terrible. I need to stop because I'm running out of time.